Many people wondered what are some of the halachos, some of the Jewish law that is applicable to elections. And it's actually quite interesting to note that elections have a very long history in Judaism, maybe not as far back as the time period of the Greeks, but they go back a pretty far way in terms of helping to define community structure throughout Europe and the Near East during non-monarchical times in the Jewish world. So specifically, when the ancient and Roman period were defined with monarchies, but there was a lot of democratic, procedural, and community structures that existed in the Middle Ages and up until almost the modern era, and including the modern era of modern Israel. Some interesting examples are if there was a matter that was needed to be decided by the city in the Jewish community, the community was to hold elections for people to be in charge of those matters. Those political matters usually revolved around entreating the local lord or feudal lord or sovereign, especially in Europe, to intercede on their behalf to protect them from barbarians and vandals and other such things, invaders and such. The reason why that was necessary was also because of the fact that Jewish communities weren't allowed to arm themselves because of things like the Theodosian Code, something that existed in the 5th century. But that'll take us too far off topic. Just know that in one of the oldest examples of democratic elections in the Jewish world, there's the example of the Maharam from Rottenburg, the mayor of Rottenburg, who was a 12th century rabbi, and he lived in what is now basically southern Germany. And he talks about electing people on the basis of their commitment to the sake of heaven, that people's intentions must be pure, and they can be elected by all the members of the community. He doesn't give any other specifics about the voters themselves, but basically it establishes some precedent that people could elect someone to be in a position of authority. Interestingly enough, some of these ideas are codified in Section 54 of the Shulchan Aruch in terms of the Jewish laws applying to electing some members of the community, such as the Chazan, the person who would lead the prayer service, was considered a public official and was to be treated as someone who would have an elected department. Or, conversely, one could elect, in many Ashkenazi countries, one could elect a board known as the Sheva Tuvei Ha'ir, the 7 people who are in charge of the welfare of the city. And those people could elect someone to properly lead services. The Siddur was not so common back in those days, and so you often needed somebody who was well versed in it. They also weren't formatted like they are now with exactly everything written out, but even the early Siddurim were simply guidebooks of how to correctly run the services. Obviously, those things changed a few hundred years later with the introduction of the printed Siddur, but still the Chazan was an important person because he also knew the tunes and the melodies along with reading the Torah itself from the scroll. Another position that was often picked by the Sheva Tuvi Ha'ir would be the rabbi of the community. That would also be elected. They also established judges. And in fact, Rav Moshe Isserles codifies in the Shulchan Aruch in the 2nd section of Choshen Mishpat, he talks about the judges are set by the people who are elected by the community. So, in a sense, you would have judges who were appointed by democratically elected members of your council. So, the idea of appointing judges was a very much a potential part of your election decision cycle when appointing people or electing people to be on your committees. Again, the standard for these things were to be elected by people living in the community, and this would allow them to have, even by Torah law, allow them to do things like enforce civil, tort, and criminal law and to counter crime and any other violations of Torah law and local standards. This even included doing things like setting immigration laws. There was many times when Jewish communities' populations were set and fixed by the local governing body, usually a non-Jewish sovereign of some kind, a feudal lord or king, and they had to set, one of the things that they would have to set would be immigration laws. You couldn't just freely move from one European city to another, and so if people wanted to find a place to live, that would have to go through these elected councils. So in electing them with voting, you also have to be a member of the city, and so there were also rules for establishing residency in these cities and in these places, and there's a number of interesting things recorded in these cases. So a couple of them are actually quite interesting. So one interesting case is a Gemara in Brachos, and it talks about appointing community leaders so it says in 55a that one had to go ahead and get the approval of many people in the community, and in order to appoint them, and that's how. And the Gemara says that was how Moshe appointed Bezalel ben Uri ben Hur. That was democratically elected. Now it's not mentioned explicitly in the pasuk, but the Talmud records this as being democratic. Another example is that the appointed people of the councils, the local councils, were not always people who were going to be the richest people, but they were the most respected people. And these people were generally going to be the ones who were permitted to go ahead and run these cases. One interesting later point of the Chassam Sofer brings down when he discusses the case of Rottenburg and their decrees there. He says that even though they can elect them, one must be made clear that it has to be done for someone who is acting in the best interest of the community. And so he says that 150 different rabbis signed a decree that you have to, that these laws, this is a law of elections, that if you have the majority of city residents, are you to choose them, and the city presidents can't be someone who is chosen by the local king to represent the Jewish people. The Jewish people in the community have to be able to choose them. And he actually is echoing a statement read by Rav Moshe Isserles from Krakow, made a couple of centuries earlier. So there's a lot of interesting ideas in election law in Jewish law. So I hope everyone enjoyed these tidbits of election law in Jewish law, and turn back into the channel anytime to learn more about Jewish law. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Beis Din directly at conversioncourtofwashington@gmail.com.